And today we're going to continue on with our lessons on the plant nutrition. So how is a leaf adapted for photosynthesis, right? In the previous lesson we talked about different external and the internal parts of the leaf. So let's look at some of the different parts of the leaf over here. So first of all, we know that the waxy cuticle that's found on the upper and the lower epidermis, right? This is going to reduce the water loss through evaporation from the leaf. And this is very important because the leaf needs water, right, in order to do photosynthesis, in order to maintain the turgidity of that leaf. Now this waxy cuticle is also transparent, right? It allows light to pass through, that allows photosynthesis to occur, right? Next thing, stomata is present in the epidermal layer, okay? And so they say stomata, where are most of the stomata found, right? About 90 to 9, maybe about 99%, depending on the species of the stomata, actually found on the lower epidermis, right? There are very few stomata at the upper epidermis. There are some possibly, but fewer, much fewer. Okay, what is the function of the stomata, right? Or singular stoma? The stomata will open in the presence of light. It will allow carbon dioxide to diffuse in and allow oxygen to diffuse out of the leaf. And this is what we call as the gaseous exchange in the leaf. Next, the chloroplast containing chlorophyll. Now remember that chloroplast is the organelle, chlorophyll is the pigment. So this chloroplast that containing chlorophyll is found in all of the mesophyll cells, okay? And the chlorophyll will absorb energy from the light, transfer it into the chemical stores of energy in the glucose, in terms of glucose molecule. From there, the glucose molecule can be converted to other forms, for example, sucrose or even starch, and then it can be used for different things. There are going to be more chloroplasts that are found in the upper palisade tissue, okay, the full saying, upper palisade mesophyll cell, mesophyll tissue. Okay, this is because there's more light that can be absorbed near the upper leaf surfaces. There's an interconnecting system of air spaces in the spongy mesophyll, right? And these air spaces, they allow for rapid diffusion of carbon dioxide and oxygen into and out of the mesophyll cells. Let's take a look at it over here. So you can see all these spaces, right? These are the intercellular air spaces. Okay, so why it's called inter is because they are in between the cells. Okay, as you can see some of these cells, you can see the inside of them, you can see all the chloroplasts that are found inside the cells. Okay, last but not least, we have the veins, right, that contain the xylem and the phloem that are situated close to the mesophyll cells. Okay, so over here, right, over here also, right, these are network of veins. Usually, right, the xylem will be the upper layer, and then the phloem will be in the lower layer. Okay, you can also see it over here. Okay, so you can see that the xylem, right, usually the xylem walls are going to be thicker, right, they're going to be more obvious, right, larger, and then whereas the phloem, right, the lumen in the phloem is going to be a lot smaller. Okay, so this is, remember, this is in the leaf. The arrangement of the xylem and the phloem is different in the leaf, and it's different in the stem, and it's different in the roots. So do watch out for that. Okay, next page. Now let's talk about how the gut cells can control the size of the stomata. Okay, so we know that the stomata is this kind of gap, right? It's actually just opening. But around the stomata, we have two gut cells. Okay, so what do the gut cells do? The gut cells help to regulate the passage of gases between the leaf and the environment. For example, right, the gut cells can reduce the amount of water vapor escaping from the leaf. When the stomata closes, to reduce water loss even when the plant is in sunlight, because maybe it's a very hot day, right? And so you want to reduce the excess water loss, because if you lose too much water, the plant will become flaccid, and so the stomata pore will close. So the plant is kind of smart lah, right? They know that it's too hot, they're actually going to reduce. But of course, when you reduce the size of the stomata, you also will reduce the gaseous exchange. So how does the gut cell actually control the opening and closing of the stomata? Let's take a look over here. Okay, this one is a bit, most likely it's not going to be tested, okay, because it's a just helpful note, but let's just talk about it anyway. Okay, so what we see is that during the day, all right, or when the condition is correct, where it's not too hot, when the sun is just nice, right, there's enough sunlight, right, there's going to be photosynthesis that occurs in these cells, right, the two gut cells. And when there's photosynthesis that occurs in these two gut cells, then the water potential of these two gut cells will decrease, right, in the cell set of this cell. So now water will enter from the surrounding cells into the gut cells by osmosis. Therefore, this cell now becomes turgid, right, becomes larger in size. And then it will start to curve. And as they curve, right, we know that the cell wall around the stomata site, right, this side, right, this cell wall is actually thicker as compared to our side. So this side thicker, this side thinner. So it will expand, right, in this way like a balloon. And therefore, you increase the size or the width of this stoma. And so the stoma will open. Okay. Now what happens if it's too hot, right? If it's too hot, the cell wants to actually reduce the size of the stoma. And so what's going to happen is that the water, there's too much water being lost, right? And so the stomata will close. Now, this means that there's going to be a loss of water from these cells. And therefore, now these cells become flaccid. And so when they become flaccid, the stomata will decrease. Okay, and so it's a very ingenious mechanism, right? This don't even need any brain function, right? It just needs open and close by itself, depending on the environment around it. Okay, so how can we actually demonstrate the presence of stomata in the leaf? Okay, so what we're going to do is we warm up or heat up a beaker of water to about 75 degrees Celsius. We take a fresh leaf, right, and hold the leaf. Usually you hold it upside down and observe what happens. Okay, so you'll start to see bubbles that are being formed on the surface of the leaf. So why is this happening? Firstly, right, you're putting the leaf into hot water. Air will expand when it's being heated, right? So now the air that's inside the leaf will expand, and because it expands, right, there's not enough space for it, so it's going to escape out from the stomata. Of course, the question says, why must the water temperature be approximately 75? Right, it's warm enough to expand the air in the leaf, but not too hot to the point where it completely denatures the leaf and changes the cell structure, which may cause some of the stomata to become denatured. Okay, let's move on to talk about how carbon dioxide and water enters the leaf. This is a very important point, so do remember and do take notes over here. Okay, so this will be your gaseous exchange as well as water entering, both very important for the purpose of photosynthesis. Okay, so in daylight, when photosynthesis occurs, the carbon dioxide in the leaf is rapidly used up, right? So inside all of these cells, they're doing photosynthesis, so they're using up our carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide concentration in the leaf becomes lower than that in the atmospheric air, so a diffusion gradient exists, right? There's a lot more carbon dioxide outside, there's lesser carbon dioxide in the cells over here. So the carbon dioxide will diffuse from the surrounding air through the stomata into the intercellular air spaces in the leaf, right, as represented by this red arrow. Now, the surfaces of the mesophyll cell, right, both your spongy mesophyll as well as your palisade mesophyll, they are also covered with a thin film of water. This thin film of water, that's represented in blue, will allow the carbon dioxide to dissolve into it. Once it has dissolved into the water, it can then diffuse into the cell, right? And then the cell can use it for photosynthesis. So the words together will be, carbon dioxide will dissolve and diffuse into the cell. Okay, so relatively simple concept to understand, right? Okay, then how then does the xylem transport water and mineral salts, right, all the way from the roots towards the leaf? Okay, so let's say that it's been raining, right, and then the water and mineral salts enter into the xylem that are found in the roots, right, in the root hair cells, and then it moves through up the stem. Finally, it goes up the stem into the network of capillary network of veins that are over here, and the xylem is over here, right, represented in this red thing. Again, you can see the size of the lumen, right, as well as the thickness of the cell wall is much bigger as compared to the phloem. Okay, so once the water are has reached this top area, right, the water and mineral salts will move from cell to cell right through the mesophyll of the leaf. Okay, what does that mean, cell to cell? That means that from here, it moves to this cell. And then this cell now has higher water potential, right? Because it got more water as compared to the next cell. So then it will go down the water potential gradient, right, to the next cell. Then this process repeats itself. It's like continuous chain from one cell to the next cell to the next cell to the next cell. All right, and this is because of the increase in water potential whenever water enters into a cell. Okay, so as we are talking about this, right, the veins in the leaf form fine branches which end amongst the mesophyll cell. These veins contain the xylem and the phloem. Together, they are called the vascular bundle. Okay, so now the cells have received their raw materials. They have their carbon dioxide, they have the water. They can now start to produce, right, their glucose by photosynthesis. And then the phloem, which is over here, would then transport, right, the sugars, right, usually it's not glucose, usually converted into other things like sucrose, that will made into the leaves to the rest of the other parts of the plant, like the stem and to the roots. Okay, let's talk about this aquatic plants, okay, or water lily. So for water lily, right, it's actually quite interesting because previously I told you, right, that maybe 90 to 99% of the stomata will be found at the lower epidermis. But for this water lily, it's different, right? Why is that the case? Firstly, the stomata are found only on the upper epidermis of the water lily. There's going to be a thick cuticle that covers the upper epidermis and no cuticle at the lower epidermis. And there are many large air chambers present near the lower surface of the leaf. Okay, why? So this plant does not lack water, right? Suggests a reason why the thick cuticle covers the upper surface of the leaf. Okay, so what's the reason? Firstly, right, it's going to prevent evaporation, and it's going to be quite thick also, right? Because it's going to prevent a lot more evaporation, right, from this upper surface of the leaf. Suggests two functions of the large air chambers found near the lower surface of the leaf. Okay, first function, right, where you got air that would decrease the density of the leaf and allow it to float, right? It allows it to float. Secondly, it also allows to trap more carbon dioxide, right, inside the air chamber so that the plant can do photosynthesis more effectively. Okay, so describe how atmospheric carbon dioxide enters the leaf, reaches the chloroplast of the mesophyll cell. Okay, again, we've talked about that in the previous section again, so I won't go back to it. Okay, so yeah, okay, and of course, one last thing, why are the stoma found at the top? Is quite an obvious reason, right? Because if the stomata will be found at the bottom of the leaf or the water lily, then water will enter into the leaf and cause it to drown. Okay, so that's it. Okay, let's talk about the xylem and the phloem. So, I'm sure that many of us have been to the rainforest around Singapore. Now, the tallest rainforest tree is actually called this seraya. Okay, I've been there. I've seen it with eyes. I wanted to climb it, but obviously cannot lah, right? You'll die. So, this tree is 60 meters tall, which is about 20-story apartment block or HDB. Okay, so how is it possible that the water and our mineral salts can be transported from the roots, right, all the way to 60 meters up in the sky, right, to the leaves, right? What are these transport tissues? And how are they suited for the transport of substances? Okay, so we are talking about these flowering plants, and so these flowering plants, they have the vascular tissues. We call them the xylem and the phloem. So what's the function of the xylem? There's two functions. First, it conducts water and dissolved mineral salts from the roots to the stems and the leaves. Secondly, the xylem provides mechanical support for the plant. Okay, so what does mechanical support mean? It simply means that it's like a structural support. It means it allows the plant to stand up straight and prevent it from toppling over. So let's look at how the xylem is adapted for its function. So a xylem vessel is a long hollow tube that stretches from the roots all the way up to the leaves. And the xylem vessel is made up of many dead cells without cytoplasm or cross walls. Okay, so you might be wondering, how come it's a dead cell? Okay, actually when the xylem is still young, when it's called immature xylem, it's actually a living thing. right? It's actually a living cell. But as it matures and it becomes from immature xylem the final form, right? It actually start to die. It removes its entire um inside, right, the protoplasm. That is, it has no more nucleus, it has no more cytoplasm, it has no more cell membrane. All of it is all gone. The only thing that it remains is your cell wall. And it also removes this cross wall. What does a cross wall mean? It means that it's the wall between two cells, right? So it forms one continuous long chain, right, all the way from the roots all the way to the leaves. And this will actually reduce the resistance to water that's flowing through the xylem. It allows water to flow through very easily. Okay, so the second function, right, is how is the xylem able to provide that mechanical support for the tree, right? This is because the inner walls of the xylem vessels are strengthened by deposits of a substance called lignin. So you can think of lignin as a bit like the metal bars that hold up our structure, right? Our HDB, right? Our HDB is made from steel bars and also made from concrete, right? And so this concrete it has to go around some kind of surface. So there are different ways that the plant can use lignin. It can be deposited in a ring form, in a spiral form, or even in a like more or less everything is lignin except for these pits, right? Different forms, and together, right? This lignin, right, is very very hard substance, right? It actually provides the mechanical support for the plant, right? So for example, if an animal hits against the plant or something, the plant wouldn't topple over, or the wind blow the plant wouldn't topple over. Okay, let's talk about how the xylem, the phloem is adapted for its function. Okay, so the phloem consists of two parts, the sieve tubes and the companion cells. Okay, and each sieve tube contains a column of an elongated thin wall living cell called the sieve tube cell or the sieve tube element. Okay, so this is in contrast to the xylem. The xylem is a dead cell, whereas the phloem is actually a living cell. But when I say living, it's actually quite interesting. It's a half alive lah, half alive. So let's look at this part over here. So this cross walls actually over here is it's called a sieve plate. Okay, it's a bit like, you know, when you cook spaghetti, you pour the water through this sieve. Yeah, it looks a bit like that, right? That sieve plates. And so this is in between two cells, right? Now, if you look carefully at this area over here, you see the yellow part, right? The yellow part, and you also see this other cell beside it that has a nucleus, right? In the slightly purple part. So the sieve tube cell, which is in the yellow and the red area, is a living cell that doesn't contain a nucleus, right? So a mature sieve tube cell only contains a thin layer of cytoplasm inside the cell that is connected to the cell above and below the host of the sieve plate. This will allow for the rapid flow of manufactured food substances throughout the sieve tubes. Okay, and so for the phloem, the flow of the food, right, can be in both directions, bidirectional. It can either be going from the top, right, from the leaves down, right, to the roots, or maybe it can be stored in the storage organs in the roots. But if the plant is really in need of food, right, maybe it's not able to do photosynthesis in the winter, then it could go the other way, right? It could actually be moving food substances from the storage organs in the roots all the way up, back up to the leaves again. Okay, but how does it do this? It actually has a companion cell, as you see in this purple with the nucleus over here. This companion cell, it carries out the metabolic processes that are needed to keep the sieve tube cell alive. And each companion cell is actually a thin, narrow, thin wall cell with many mitochondria. So not shown in the picture, but it has a lot more mitochondria than a typical cell because it needs to release a lot of energy, right? In order for the companion cell to load the sugar from the mesophyll cells into the sieve tube by active transport. So every time the sugars are moving, it needs to be loaded through or pushed through the sieve plates, right, into this the sieve tube cells. And this requires active transport. Active transport requires a lot of energy that comes from that's released through the process of respiration. Okay, so what else can we see? Okay, let's take a look at the vascular tissue in the stems. Okay, so remember in the stem, the way that the vascular tissues are organized in the stem and the roots and the leaves, all very different. So in the stem, within a vascular bundle, the xylem is located closer inside, and the phloem is located more towards the outside. Okay, there's this thin layer called a cambium in between them, but don't worry about that. There's just a layer of cells that separates the xylem and the phloem. Lastly, the stem is covered by a layer of cells called the epidermis. Right, and this epidermis is protected by a waxy waterproof cuticle that greatly reduces the evaporation of water from stem. Right, I already told you about the waxy cuticle before. Okay, the word epidermis, it simply means the outer layer. Right, it's a bit similar to the human skin, right, like an outer layer of skin. Okay, so here we see, if you zoom in right onto this one over here, right, focusing on the layer of the xylem here, this is the xylem, which is on the inner side of the stem. And then if you look over here, right, the cambium, and then the phloem on the outer ring of the stem. So you might be wondering, why is the xylem found on the inner ring of the stem? Now if you think about it, what will happen if it was on the outside, right? It could be more easily damaged. And remember, water is very, very essential for the survival of the plant, right? Also insects, you know, they will try to bite into the plant stem, they try to suck up the plant, right? And so it's safer for the plant to keep the water on the inside, right? It's more important for it, right? Then food on the outside. Maybe food not so important, can always make more. Okay, so if the plant get any injury or something like that, then it can survive. Okay, now we talk about the vascular tissue in the leaves, which again are arranged differently. The xylem on the top upper surface area and the phloem on the lower surface area. Okay, so why is the case? It's because the upper surface usually faces the sun, right? And then evaporates more, so the water here would be able to move quicker to the upper surface, right? Provide the cells, all the cells in this leaf with the water that it needs to prevent it from becoming flaccid. Okay, next we talk about the vascular tissue in the roots. So the epidermis of the root is the outermost layer of the cells, and it also holds onto the root hairs. And each of the root hair is a long and narrow extension that's growing out of the epidermal cell. And this long and narrow extension of the root hair will increase the surface area to volume ratio of the root hair cell. That will allow it to increase the rate of absorption of water and mineral salts, both by osmosis and by active transport. Okay, so if you look carefully, you can see that the arrangement of the xylem and the phloem is very interesting. The xylem forms an X shape, right? X for xylem, right? And the phloem takes up the spaces around the X. Okay, if you look carefully over here, I can see this X xylem, and you can see the phloem at the four corners around it. Okay, all right, so this is the section of the stem which tissue would transport water up the stem. Okay, so we need to look for the xylem, and the xylem would be the inner ring, which would be E, right? Which tissue would transport sugars and amino acids? That will be our phloem. The phloem is on the outer surface, and that will be our C. All right, and which tissue provides support, okay, or mechanical support for the stem? Again, that will be our xylem, which is on the inner one, right, and that will be our E. Okay, then what about the rest? Things like maybe D. D will be the cambium, then A would be the epidermal tissue. Okay, I will pause here, and then I will continue this lecture in another video. Okay, thank you for listening. Do watch the video again if you did miss out anything, and read your textbook yourself. I mean, a lot of this information is all I'm more or less just reading verbatim from the textbook, okay, with a little extra context to it. Okay, I'll see you back in school. Have a good holiday. Right, bye bye.